Hey everybody, my name is SPAZ and I'm a CD junkie. On this episode of CD Junkie, I'm going to talk about a Canadian band that is more than just their two-hit singles. Yes, everybody knows Men Without Hats because of the Safety Dance and Pop Goes the World. But like any other one or two hit wonders, there's so much more to the band, and I'm here to tell you about them. Of course, I got into the band not because of Safety Dance, but because I had heard maybe a song on K-Rock, like Antarctica or something. But I rushed out and I bought the album Rhythm of Youth, which was their debut album. And that's how I got into the band. And then a few months later, Safety Dance was huge, and that's kind of what they're known for. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of go through their history a little bit and show you that you know, they don't have one album or just two albums, and they were constantly evolving musically. So let's start with something I don't have on CD. That's never been released on CD. It's an EP from 1980 called Folk of the 80s. And that contained the first signs of their greatness. But it wasn't until 1982, one of my favorite years for music, that Rhythm of Youth came out. Now, you obviously know them from Safety Dance, but there's a bunch of great songs on here, like I Got the Message and I Like and Living in China. It's a real fun album. Yes, it's synth pop, and it never really takes itself too seriously, and that's a great thing about bands. Now, they could be actually recording songs that are serious, but the joy in and excitement in creating the art is really shines through. And this is the Canadian version, their Canadian remaster, and it does contain some bonus tracks, as you can tell right there. Definitely a recommended album for synth pop enthusiasts. 2 years later, they follow that up with Folk of the 80s Part 3. So we're assuming that Rhythm of Youth, the previous album, was Part 2, because their first EP was Folk of the 80s. Anyway, this album sort of builds upon Rhythm of Youth. It's a great little collection, quirky and melodic and synth poppy. They add some more guitars to the mix, not too much, but it's still a great collection of songs. Where Did the Boys Go was a big song off of here, but Messiahs Die Young is another great one. And as you can tell, it's got a bonus track there. Now, the following year, 1985, they put out a Freeways EP, which has never been released on CD. But it still took another 2 years for the band to return with Pop Goes the World, and boy, was this a great pop album. Now, the band had totally morphed. It was still Ivan up front, but the songs were beefier. They relied more on samples as opposed to just, synthesizers and stuff. So you'll hear a lot of voices sampled, but it's a fun album. It's melodic. It's humorous. Of course, the song Pop Goes the World was a big hit for them, but there's also a song like Moonbeam. On Tuesdays was a great track, which featured Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull on flute. But yeah, this is just a real solid album. A pretty big leap from Rhythm of Youth and Folk of the 80s 3, which is great. I love when bands evolve and change. So it took another 2 years before The Adventures of Women and Men Without Hate in the 21st Century came out. This was 1989. And this was the band evolving again. This was the band adding more guitars, not relying on that fun synth sound, a little more serious in tone, a little darker in tone, but still a great collection of songs. As I said, this came out in 1989. And this, since it was heavier on guitar, you would figure that the next album, of course, would be, the next step in that evolution. And it certainly was, because by the time they released Sideways in 1991, there were no synthesizers in the band. It was all guitar. It was like a wall of guitars, bass, drums, and Ivan out in front. And it's just, If you think that's like a weird concept, Men Without Hats with no synthesizers, trust me, it's a great collection of songs. I mean, the title track alone is fantastic. And for you Beatle freaks, you'll notice that they do a cover version of I Am the Walrus. And this is more Britpop than synth pop. This was closer to Ned's Atomic Dustbin than it was Heaven 17. So yeah, it's a great record. I think it took everybody by surprise, and it wasn't even released in the U.S. I think people were scared that Men Without Hats, wow, they evolved. Nobody's going to care in the U.S. It's like, if they had released it, they would have gotten some kind of attention. But yeah, this was a great album, Sideways by Men Without Hats. And that was it. They split up. I mean, the band was generally Ivan Doroshuk on vocals. Stefan Doroshuk played a lot of the instruments, and Colin Doroshuk was in there somewhere, plus, various other players. So the Doroshuk brothers. But by the time that Ivan returned to music in 1997, his brothers weren't involved. So he put out a solo album called The Spell. This is Ivan, the lead singer of Men Without Hats, and this is going back to electronics, but it's more of a techno or house sounding album. It's really fun, really upbeat, great time, back to having fun with music and stuff. But, it's a step away from Men Without Hats, which is perfectly fine by me. Complete step away from the previous album, Sideways. So when Ivan went back in the studio to record his second album, it sort of morphed into a brand new Men Without Hats album. Now, Ivan, he sort of became the face and the voice of the band. So he, from this point on, has operated under the Men Without Hats name. Now, this right here was 2003. It's called No Hats Beyond This Point. Doesn't sound like it was recorded in an actual recording studio. It sounds like a lot of it was, captured either on a Macintosh computer, some kind of program. So it's electronic, but it's not synth poppy. But it's still poppy, and it's still, a lot of great songs. And it definitely sounds like Men Without Hats, but it's not that old synthesizer sound. It's more programmed electronics and such. But if you were wondering if they were ever going to return to that synth pop sound, all you had to do was wait until 2012 when they released Love in the Age of War. This is an album from 2012, and this is totally a return to the synth pop sound of their first few albums. Definitely. In fact, this was produced by Dave Ogilvy of Skinny Puppy, if you can believe that. And they didn't just program the keyboards. They actually went back and used synthesizers on this album. I think their initial idea was, let's make a sequel to Rhythm of Youth. And this certainly sounds like it. Again, great pop songs, great melodies. If you love synth pop, and especially if you love Men Without Hats, this was definitely the one to get. But anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it inspires you to check out Men Without Hats, because they are definitely much more than Safety Dance and Pop Goes the World. But until the next time we meet, my name is SPAZ, and I'm a CD junkie.